My name is Margaret Thompson, and for 37 years I believed I was living the perfect Christian life. I was a devoted member of the Covenant Fellowship Church in Cedar Springs, a small town nestled in the heart of Indiana, where everyone knew everyone. And faith wasn't just a Sunday affair, it was the foundation of everything we did. Every Wednesday evening, you'd find me in the front pew for Bible study. Every Sunday morning, I was there an hour early, arranging flowers and making sure the hymnals were perfectly aligned. And every second Saturday, I helped organize the church's community outreach programs, distributing food to families in need. At 62, I had earned the respect that comes with decades of faithful service. Pastor David Henley often called me the backbone of our congregation, and those words made my heart swell with pride every single time. My late husband Robert used to joke that I loved that church more than I loved him, and sometimes I wondered if he wasn't entirely wrong. After Robert passed in the spring of 2018, the church became not just my spiritual home, but my entire world. It was where I found purpose, community, and the sense that my life mattered in God's grand design. The church building itself was modest but beautiful, with stained glass windows that caught the morning light just right, and wooden pews that had been polished smooth by 3 generations of faithful hands. The smell of old wood and lemon oil mixed with the faint scent of the roses I brought from my garden every week. It was a place where time seemed to move differently, where the outside world's chaos couldn't penetrate the sanctuary we had built together. Pastor Henley had been leading our congregation for almost 15 years, ever since Pastor Morrison retired. David was everything you'd want in a spiritual leader, charismatic without being flashy, learned without being condescending, and seemingly devoted to every member of his flock. He remembered everyone's names, asked about sick relatives, and had a gift for making his sermons feel like personal conversations rather than lectures. The congregation had grown under his leadership, from barely 60 members when he arrived to over 200 by the time my story begins. I served as head of the ladies' ministry, a role that put me in charge of organizing everything from baby showers to funeral luncheons, from the annual Christmas pageant to the weekly prayer circles that met in my living room every Thursday evening. My house on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and sprawling front porch, had become an unofficial extension of the church. The ladies would arrive promptly at 7, carrying casseroles and homemade desserts, and we'd spend 2 hours praying for our families, our community, and the various mission projects we supported around the world. Margaret always knows exactly what to say, Sister Helen would tell newcomers. If you have a problem, she's the one to talk to. And I took that responsibility seriously. Over the years, I had counseled young mothers struggling with postpartum depression, helped arrange emergency funds for families facing foreclosure, and even mediated disputes between church members who couldn't see eye to eye. I believed that God had given me a gift for bringing people together, for healing wounds and building bridges. But looking back now, I realize that my greatest strength, my unwavering loyalty and trust, was also setting the stage for my greatest trial. It started with something small, almost insignificant. During our monthly finance committee meeting in early September, I noticed a discrepancy in the building fund reports. We had been saving for years to renovate the church basement into a proper fellowship hall, and I kept meticulous records of every bake sale, every special offering, every generous donation that came in. The numbers didn't quite add up. Where we should have had nearly $40,000, the report showed only $36,000. Pastor, I said, raising my hand gently during the meeting, I think there might be an error in the building fund calculation. David glanced at the treasurer, Mr. Patterson, who quickly shuffled through his papers with obvious nervousness. Oh, that's right, the pastor said smoothly. We had some unexpected maintenance expenses last month. The church roof needed emergency repairs, and we had to dip into the building fund temporarily. Don't worry, Margaret, we'll replenish it soon. His explanation seemed reasonable. The roof had been leaking during that terrible storm in August, and church maintenance was always a priority. I trusted Pastor Henley completely. After all, he had never given me any reason to doubt his integrity. But something about Mr. Patterson's nervous fidgeting stuck in my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. 3 weeks later, I was organizing the church files in preparation for our annual audit when I found the repair invoices. The roof. Work had indeed been done, but it had cost only $1,200, nowhere near the $4,000 that had been withdrawn from the building fund. My hands trembled slightly as I double-checked the dates and amounts. There had to be an explanation. There always was with financial matters. They could be so complicated, and I'd never been particularly good with numbers. But as I sat there in the church office, that quiet Thursday afternoon, with dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through the windows, I felt something shift inside me. It was barely perceptible, like the first hairline crack in a foundation that would eventually bring down an entire building. For the first time in 37 years, I found myself questioning something about my beloved church. And that tiny seed of doubt, once planted, would grow into something that would change everything I thought I knew about faith, trust, and the institutions we hold most sacred. The days following my discovery felt like walking through fog. I went through my usual routines, tending my garden, preparing for Thursday prayer meetings, organizing the upcoming harvest festival, but everything felt different somehow. During our prayer circle that week, I found myself watching the other ladies more carefully, wondering if any of them had noticed what I had seen. Sister Helen Morrison, 73, and sharp as a tack despite her age, had been attending Covenant Fellowship longer than anyone except old Mr. Peterson. She remembered when the church was just a tiny white building with folding chairs instead of pews. Helen had a way of seeing through pretense that sometimes made people uncomfortable, but her heart was pure gold. She had raised 5 children as a single mother after her husband died in Vietnam, and every one of them had grown up to be productive members of society. "You seem troubled, dear," Helen said to me after our prayer session, her weathered hands wrapping around her coffee cup. "Is everything all right?" I almost told her right then. The words were sitting on the tip of my tongue, begging to be spoken. But something held me back. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was simply the lifetime habit of keeping church business within the church family. "Just tired," I said instead. "You know how busy things get this time of year." But Helen's pale blue eyes studied my face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades reading between the lines. She didn't press, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Sister Carol Jenkins was our youngest member on the Ladies' Ministry Board at 48. She had joined the church 6 years earlier after her divorce, bringing her 2 teenage daughters with her. Carol worked as a nurse at Cedar Springs General Hospital, which meant she was practical, observant, and not easily fooled by smooth explanations. She had grown up Catholic, but found our Protestant approach more welcoming to her situation as a divorced woman. "Pastor Henley has been such a blessing to our family," she often said. "I don't know where we'd be without his guidance." Carol's devotion to the pastor was particularly strong because he had personally counseled her through some dark days after her divorce. When her ex-husband stopped paying child support, the church had quietly helped with groceries and school supplies. Carol saw Pastor Henley as the man who had literally saved her family from financial ruin. Then there was Sister Ruth Blackwood, 67, and our unofficial church historian. Ruth kept detailed records of everything, every sermon topic, every special event, every family milestone. Her basement was filled with photo albums, newspaper clippings, and documents dating back to the church's founding in 1952. If anyone would notice financial irregularities over time, it would be Ruth. Ruth had never married, dedicating her entire life to teaching Sunday school and serving the church. She lived in the same small house she had inherited from her parents, driving the same 1987 Buick she had bought new 35 years ago. Money had always been tight for Ruth, but she tithed faithfully every month, often giving more than she could really afford. "The Lord always provides," Ruth would say when anyone expressed concern about her generous giving. "He's never failed me yet." During that period of growing unease, I also found myself paying closer attention to Pastor Henley himself. David had arrived in Cedar Springs as a young man of 32, fresh from seminary and full of enthusiasm for building God's kingdom. He was handsome in a wholesome way that made mothers beam and daughters blush, with thick brown hair that was just beginning to show grey at the temples and kind brown eyes that seemed to look straight into your soul when he spoke to you. Over the years, I had watched him mature into the role of spiritual father dozens of weddings, baptized countless babies, and comforted grieving families through their darkest hours. His sermons were thoughtful and inspiring, always grounded in Scripture, but relevant to contemporary life. He had a particular gift for making complex theological concepts accessible to ordinary people like us. Pastor Henley lived in the parsonage next to the church with his wife Sarah and their 3 children, Michael, 16, Emma, 14, and little Joshua, just 8 years old. Sarah was a perfect pastor's wife, gracious, supportive, and always ready with a casserole for anyone going through a difficult time. She taught the children's Sunday school class and organized the annual Christmas pageant with military precision. The Henley family appeared to live modestly on the pastor's salary, which I knew couldn't be more than $50,000 a year. They drove an older Honda sedan and shopped at the same discount grocery store as everyone else in town. Their children wore hand-me-downs and participated in church activities rather than expensive extracurricular programs. From all outward appearances, they were a family committed to living simply so they could dedicate their lives to ministry. But in the weeks following my discovery of the financial discrepancy, I began noticing small things that hadn't registered before. Pastor Henley's watch looked expensive, much more expensive than anything a man earning $50,000 a year should be wearing. When I complimented him on it after Sunday service, he laughed it off, saying it was a graduation gift from his parents that he'd had for years. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, but something about the way his eyes darted away when he said it made me uncomfortable. A few days later, I was walking my dog past the parsonage when I noticed Sarah loading grocery bags into their car. Even from a distance, I could see they were from Gentry's Market, the upscale grocery store on the other side of town, where organic vegetables cost twice as much as they did at Pete's Supermarket, where the rest of us shopped. Again, there could be an innocent explanation. Maybe someone had given her a gift card, or maybe they were buying special items for a church event. But combined with my growing concerns about the building fund, even small details began to take on sinister significance. Mr. Patterson, our treasurer, was a quiet man in his 70s who had been handling the church's finances for almost a decade. He was a retired accountant, methodical and careful with numbers, which was why his nervous behavior during that finance meeting had been so unusual. Theodore Patterson had moved to Cedar Springs after his retirement to be closer to his daughter's family, and he had immediately become involved in church activities. His wife Martha sang in the choir, and they rarely missed a service or church event. Theodore had always been completely transparent about church finances, providing detailed monthly reports and welcoming questions from anyone who wanted to understand how their tithing dollars were being spent. He kept meticulous records and was always eager to explain any entry that seemed unclear. His sudden nervousness when I asked about the building fund was completely out of character. The more I observed and remembered, the more pieces of a disturbing puzzle began to form in my mind. There was the time last spring when Pastor Henley had returned from a ministry conference in Chicago with a new laptop that must have cost at least $1,500. There were the occasional dinners at the country club that he claimed were outreach opportunities to witness to the community's business leaders. There was the fact that his children always seemed to have the latest electronic devices, despite the family's supposed commitment to simple living. None of these things were definitively suspicious on their own. Pastors deserved nice things too, and there were always wealthy church members who enjoyed blessing their spiritual leaders with generous gifts. But taken together, especially in light of the missing building fund money, they painted a picture that made my stomach churn with the possibility that the man I had trusted and respected for 15 years might not be the person I thought he was. As October arrived and the leaves began their spectacular autumn transformation, I found myself caught between two impossible choices: continue ignoring my growing suspicions and risk being complicit in potential wrongdoing, or investigate further and risk destroying my faith in the man and institution that had given my life meaning for over 3 decades. The weight of that decision pressed down on me like a physical burden, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Late at night, lying in the bed I had shared with Robert for 43 years, I would stare at the ceiling and pray for guidance. But for the first time in my life, the heavens seemed silent, offering no clear direction for the storm that was gathering on the horizon of my orderly, faithful world. The October chill seemed to seep into my bones as I sat in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, nursing my second cup of coffee and staring at the church financial records I had quietly photocopied the day before. The numbers stared back at me like accusatory eyes, each discrepancy a small wound in the faith I had built my entire adult life upon. Over the past month, I had discovered not just one missing $4,000, but a pattern that stretched back nearly 2 years. The mission fund, which we had worked so hard to build through countless bake sales and special collections, showed irregular withdrawals that didn't correspond to any mission work I knew about. The discretionary fund, meant to help church families facing emergencies, had been accessed repeatedly for vague, administrative expenses. Even the youth ministry budget, funded largely by donations from grandparents hoping to support their grandchildren's spiritual development, showed unexplained gaps. My hands shook slightly as I spread the papers across my kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had shared breakfast for 43 years, where we had discussed everything, from the children's report cards to our dreams of retirement travel. Now, in the morning light filtering through my yellow gingham curtains, I was confronting a truth that threatened to destroy everything I held sacred. The sound of my phone ringing made me jump. It was Sister Helen. "Margaret, dear, could you come? By this morning, I need to discuss something with you about the church." Her tone was different, serious in a way that made my stomach clench. Helen lived just 6 blocks away in a small blue house that she kept as neat as a pin despite her advancing age. When I arrived, I found her sitting at her own kitchen table with a manila folder in front of her. "I've been watching you," she said, without preamble. "You've been troubled for weeks, and I think I know why." Helen opened the folder, revealing her own collection of documents. Unlike my hastily copied papers, hers were organized with the precision of someone who had been investigating for much longer than I had. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've suspected for over a year," Helen replied, "but I wanted to be absolutely certain before I said anything. I've been keeping my own records, comparing them with what Theodore reports at the meetings." Helen's documentation was thorough and devastating. She had tracked not only the financial discrepancies I had discovered, but also patterns of behavior that painted an even darker picture. Pastor Henley's emergency trips to visit sick parishioners in other cities that no one else seemed to know about, conference expenses that were double what they should have been, equipment purchases for the church that never seemed to materialize. But how? I asked. Theodore has always been so careful with the books. Helen's expression was grim. I think Theodore is being manipulated, possibly even threatened. Have you noticed how nervous he's become? How he avoids making eye contact during finance meetings? I don't think he's stealing the money, Margaret. I think he's being forced to cook the books by someone he's too afraid to refuse. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Pastor Henley wasn't just stealing from the church. He was destroying good people like Theodore in the process, using their loyalty and fear against them. Over the following days, Helen and I began working together, carefully documenting everything we could find. We discovered that the pattern had started small, shortly after Pastor Henley's wife, Sarah, had been diagnosed with what he called ongoing health issues that required expensive treatments not covered by their insurance. The congregation had responded with typical generosity, taking up special collections and organizing fundraisers to help with medical expenses. But according to Helen's research at the county health department, where her niece worked as a records clerk, there was no evidence of Sarah Henley ever being treated at any of the local medical facilities for serious health problems. The supposed medical emergency that had triggered our community's generous response appeared to be completely fabricated. This changes everything, I said, as we sat in Helen's living room, surrounded by evidence of betrayal that seemed to grow, more extensive every day. It's not just stealing, it's fraud. He's been lying to us about everything. The weight of our discovery was overwhelming. This wasn't just about money disappearing from church accounts. It was about trust violated, faith manipulated, and an entire community being systematically deceived by the person they had honesty and integrity. Every counseling session where Pastor Henley had guided people through moral dilemmas, every moment of spiritual comfort he had provided was now tainted by the knowledge of his deception. But our investigation was about to take an even more disturbing turn. Sister Carol, the nurse who worked at the hospital, approached me after Wednesday evening Bible study with a concerned expression. "Margaret, could I speak with you privately?" We stepped outside, into the cool October air, and Carol's usual composure seemed shaken. "I need to tell someone, and I think you're the person I can trust," she said. "It's about Pastor Henley and the counseling sessions." My heart sank as Carol described uncomfortable interactions during private counseling meetings. Nothing overtly inappropriate. She was quick to clarify, but boundary crossings that had made her increasingly uncomfortable. Questions about her personal relationships that seemed more prurient than pastoral. Physical contact that lasted a moment too long. Comments about her appearance that had no place in a spiritual context. "I've been telling myself I was imagining things," Carol said, her voice barely audible. "But when Sarah mentioned to me last month that David had been helping several divorced women in the congregation with special counseling, something didn't feel right. The pieces of a larger pattern began forming in my mind. Pastor Henley had positioned himself as a particular champion of divorced women and single mothers, often noting in sermons how Jesus himself had shown special compassion for women in difficult circumstances. I had always admired his progressive attitude toward women who had been rejected by more conservative churches. Now I wondered if his advocacy had been motivated by something far less noble than Christian compassion. Carol wasn't the only one. Over the next week, as word quietly spread that Helen and I were asking careful questions about church concerns, 3 other women approached us with similar stories. Sister Janet, who had been divorced for 5 years and was raising 2 children alone. Sister Donna, whose husband had left her for a younger woman 3 years ago. Sister Patricia, a widow who had moved to Cedar Springs to start fresh after her husband's death. Each woman described the same pattern: intensive counseling sessions that gradually became more personal, boundary violations disguised as pastoral care, and an increasing sense of discomfort that they had dismissed as their own spiritual inadequacy. None of them had experienced anything that could be clearly labeled as assault, but all of them described feeling manipulated and confused by interactions that seemed to exploit their vulnerability rather than provide genuine spiritual support. He has this way of making you feel like you're the only one who truly understands him, Janet confided during a hushed conversation in my living room. Like God has brought you together for a special purpose that others wouldn't comprehend. The manipulation was subtle but systematic. Pastor Henley would identify women who were emotionally vulnerable, divorced, widowed, or struggling with marital problems, and offer them intensive pastoral care that gradually became inappropriately personal. He would frame his attention as God's special blessing on them, making them feel chosen and important, while slowly normalizing interactions that pushed beyond appropriate pastoral boundaries. Meanwhile, our financial investigation continued to reveal the scope of his deception. Helen had managed to obtain bank records through her own considerable detective skills, and we discovered that Pastor Henley had been living far beyond his declared income. The modest lifestyle he displayed publicly was apparently a carefully maintained facade. The expensive watch wasn't a graduation gift. It was one of several luxury items he had purchased over the past 2 years. The family's supposed simple living was contradicted by credit card records showing regular dinners at expensive restaurants, high-end clothing purchases, and electronics that cost more than many of our church members earned in a month. Most damaging of all, we discovered that he had been using church money to pay for hotel rooms and weekend trips that corresponded with times when various vulnerable women in the congregation had mentioned being away for spiritual retreats or personal renewal weekends. The pattern was clear and devastating. Pastor Henley was systematically exploiting the trust and vulnerability of his congregation for both financial and personal gain. He was stealing money that hard-working families had sacrificed to give, while simultaneously manipulating emotionally fragile women who had come to him seeking spiritual healing. As November arrived with its gray skies and bare trees, Helen and I faced an agonizing decision. We had enough evidence to expose Pastor Henley's deceptions, but doing so would destroy not just his life and career, but potentially devastate our entire church community. Many of our members had invested everything, emotionally, financially, and spiritually, in their faith in this institution and its leader. Theodore Patterson, we realized, was probably keeping quiet not just from fear, but from a misguided attempt to protect the church from scandal. Several of the women who had been manipulated were still defending Pastor Henley, convinced that any discomfort they had felt was their own fault rather than evidence of his inappropriate behavior. People don't want to believe their trust has been betrayed, Helen observed sadly as we sat in her living room, looking out at the church steeple visible through her front window. They'll fight to preserve their illusions, even when the truth is staring them in the face. The breaking point came during the first week of November, when Sister Ruth approached me with trembling hands and tears in her eyes. "Margaret, I need to show you something," she said, leading me to her basement archive room. "I've been going through old records, trying to understand some discrepancies I noticed, and I found this." Ruth handed me a folder containing correspondence between Pastor Henley and the previous church he had served before coming to Cedar Springs. The letters, which had somehow ended up misfiled among general church documents, painted a picture that made my blood run cold. Pastor Henley hadn't left his previous position to answer God's call to serve our community. He had been quietly forced to resign following allegations of financial impropriety and inappropriate relationships with female parishioners. The allegations had never been formally pursued because the previous church had wanted to avoid scandal, but they had essentially blacklisted him from serving in their denomination. Our church board, in their eagerness to fill the pastoral position quickly after Pastor Morrison's retirement, had apparently failed to conduct thorough background checks. Pastor Henley had presented himself as a dynamic young minister looking for a new challenge, and they had accepted his explanation without verification. "He's done this before," I whispered, staring at the damning documents. "We're not his first victims." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with all our evidence spread before me, knowing that tomorrow I would have to make the most difficult decision of my life. I could continue protecting the institution I loved by staying silent, or I could speak the truth and watch as everything I had devoted my adult life to building came crashing down around us. But as I looked at the faces in the old church directory, all the faithful people who trusted their pastor and believed in the mission we were all supposedly serving together, I realized that silence would make me complicit in perpetuating a fraud that was destroying lives one betrayal at a time. The truth, no matter how painful, was the only path forward that honored the authentic faith I had tried to live my entire life. The November rain drummed against the church windows as I stood outside Pastor Henley's office door, my hand frozen just inches from the wood. Inside that folder tucked under my arm was everything: bank records, correspondence from his previous church, testimonies from the women he had manipulated, and months of financial documentation that Helen and I had painstakingly compiled. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and about to change everything. I had prayed about this moment for 3 sleepless nights, asking God for the strength to do what I knew was right, even though it would destroy the community I loved. The hallway was empty. Most people had gone home after Wednesday evening service, but I could see light under Pastor Henley's door and hear him moving around inside. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. "Come in," came his familiar voice, the same warm tone that had comforted me through Robert's funeral, that had guided our congregation through countless sermons, that had made me feel safe and protected for 15 years. Pastor Henley looked up from his desk with a smile that faltered slightly when he saw my expression. He was wearing that expensive watch, I noticed, the one he claimed was a graduation gift, but which I now knew he had purchased with money stolen from our building fund. "Margaret, what brings you here so late? You look troubled." I sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where countless church members had sought his counsel, where vulnerable women had been manipulated, where Theodore Patterson had probably been coerced into falsifying financial records. "David," I said, using his first name deliberately, "we need to talk about the church finances." Something shifted in his expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, a slight straightening of his shoulders, but his pastoral mask remained in place. I appreciate your dedication to the church's financial well-being. What specific concerns do you have? I opened the folder and placed the first document on his desk, the building fund discrepancy that had started my investigation. 2 months ago, this shows $4,000 missing from the building fund, supposedly for roof repairs that cost only $1,200. Pastor Henley glanced at the paper with practiced calm. "Oh, that. Yes, there were additional maintenance issues that came up after the initial repair. I think Theodore may have forgotten to include those invoices in the summary." "No," I said quietly, placing the next document on his desk. "These are all the maintenance invoices for the past year. Every single one. The total doesn't come close to $4,000. His smile became more strained, but he maintained his composure. "Margaret, I appreciate your thoroughness, but sometimes these financial matters are more complex than they appear. Perhaps we should discuss this with Theodore present so he can clarify." "Theodore isn't the problem," I interrupted, placing the bank records on his desk. "You are." The pastoral mask finally slipped. For just a moment I saw something cold, and calculating flash across his features before he composed himself again. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I find your tone quite concerning. Perhaps you're still struggling with grief over Robert's passing, and it's affecting your judgment." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost questioned myself for a split second. This was exactly how he had operated for years, deflecting, gaslighting, using people's emotions against them. But I had spent too many hours preparing for this moment to be derailed now. These bank records show luxury purchases, expensive dinners, and hotel bookings that don't match your declared income, I said, placing each piece of evidence methodically on his desk. "This correspondence shows you were forced to resign from your previous church for the same behavior you're exhibiting here." Pastor Henley's composure cracked. He stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "You have no right to investigate my personal affairs," he said, his voice taking on an edge I had never heard before. "What I do with my family's finances is none of your business. It becomes my business when you're funding your lifestyle by stealing from church members who sacrifice their own comfort to support God's work," I replied, standing to face him. "It becomes my business when you manipulate vulnerable women who come to you seeking spiritual guidance." "That's enough," he snapped, his mask completely falling away now. "I don't have to listen to wild accusations from a bitter old woman who can't accept that her time of influence in this church is over." The cruelty in his voice was shocking, but it also confirmed everything I had suspected. This was the real David Henley, not the caring pastor, but a predator who had been using our faith and trust as weapons against us. "You're right," I said calmly, gathering up the documents. "You don't have to listen to me, but you will have to answer to the church board, to the congregation, and to the authorities." His face went pale. "You wouldn't dare destroy this church over your petty suspicions." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied, walking toward the door. "I'm trying to save it. This church existed long before you came here, and it will survive long after you're gone. But it can't survive if we allow you to continue poisoning it from within." As I reached for the door handle, he called out desperately, "Margaret, wait, please. Let's talk about this rationally. Perhaps there have been some accounting errors, some misunderstandings. We can work this out quietly between us. There's no need to involve others and cause unnecessary pain to the congregation." I turned back to face him one last time. The man standing behind that desk bore no resemblance to the spiritual leader I had respected and trusted for 15 years. His carefully maintained facade had crumbled, revealing someone hollow and desperate beneath. "The pain has already been caused, David. To Theodore, to Carol, to Janet, to all the other women you've manipulated, to every church member who trusted you with their hard-earned money. I'm not causing pain. I'm just refusing to help you hide it anymore." I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, my legs trembling but my resolve firm. Tomorrow morning, I would present our evidence to the church board. By Sunday, the congregation would know the truth about the man they had trusted with their spiritual welfare. And whatever came after that, we would face it together as a community united by authentic faith rather than blind trust in a false shepherd. As I walked through the empty church sanctuary toward the exit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the artificial peace of willful ignorance, but the deep, abiding peace that comes from choosing truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faith over the institutions that sometimes betray it. The rain had stopped by the time I reached. My car and stars were beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. The emergency board meeting was called for Thursday evening, less than 24 hours after my confrontation with Pastor Henley. I arrived early, carrying 2 boxes of carefully organized evidence that Helen and I had spent the morning preparing. The church basement meeting room felt smaller than usual, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the familiar faces of board members I had known for years. Board Chairman Robert Fitzgerald, a retired high school principal with silver hair and kind eyes, looked exhausted as he called the meeting to order. Word had already begun to spread through the congregation, carried in hushed phone calls and worried whispers in grocery store aisles. Cedar Springs was too small a town to keep secrets for long. Margaret has requested this emergency session to address concerns about church finances and pastoral conduct, Mr. Fitzgerald announced solemnly. Pastor Henley has been notified, but has chosen not to attend. That absence spoke volumes. An innocent man would have fought to defend his reputation, would have demanded the opportunity to refute false accusations. Pastor Henley's decision to avoid the meeting was itself an admission of guilt. Theodore Patterson sat at the far end of the table, his face grey and drawn. When I presented the financial documents, his hands shook as he examined records he knew were accurate but had been forced to misrepresent for months. The relief in his eyes was palpable when he finally found his voice. "It's all true," he whispered, his words barely audible in the silent room. "He told me the money was for emergency medical expenses for Sarah. He said if I didn't help him temporarily restructure the accounts, she might die from lack of proper treatment. I believed him. God help me. I believed every lie." Theodore's confession opened the floodgates. For months, he had been carrying the burden of deception alone, terrified that exposing Pastor Henley would somehow make him responsible for Sarah's supposed death. The revelation that her medical crisis had been fabricated hit him like a physical blow. "He showed me medical bills," Theodore continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, official-looking documents that seemed to prove how desperate their situation was. "I thought I was helping save a life. Instead, I was helping him steal from people who trusted us both." Board member Susan Carr, who owned the town's only bookstore and had served on various church committees for over a decade, spoke next. "The financial evidence is damning enough, but Margaret, you mentioned concerns about pastoral conduct as well. This was the most difficult part of the evening. One by one, the women who had been manipulated by Pastor Henley shared their experiences. Carol spoke about the inappropriate counseling sessions that had made her question her own perceptions of proper pastoral care. Janet described how Pastor Henley had gradually convinced her that their special relationship was ordained by God, making her feel simultaneously chosen and ashamed. "I thought I was losing my mind," Janet said, her voice steady but her hands trembling, "when he would touch my shoulder just a little too long or ask questions about my intimate life that seemed too personal. I told myself I was being paranoid. He had this way of making you feel like any discomfort you felt was evidence of your own spiritual immaturity." The pattern was clear and devastating. Pastor Henley had systematically identified and exploited the most vulnerable women in the congregation, using his position of spiritual authority to manipulate them into accepting inappropriate behavior, while convincing them that their discomfort was their own fault. Board member James Morrison, Pastor Morrison's nephew and a local attorney, took careful notes as each woman spoke. His legal background made him particularly concerned about the church's liability in allowing such behavior to continue unchecked. "Based on what we've heard tonight, we have both criminal fraud and potential civil liability issues," he said grimly. "We need to contact law enforcement immediately, and we need to consider how to protect the church from lawsuits while ensuring justice for the victims." The discussion that followed was painful, but necessary. How do you inform a congregation that their spiritual leader has been systematically betraying their trust? How do you maintain faith in an institution when its most visible representative has proven to be fundamentally corrupt? "We could handle this quietly," suggested board member Patricia Williams, a retired teacher who had always preferred to resign for personal reasons, transfer quietly to another congregation where he could start fresh. The silence that followed her suggestion was deafening. It was Helen who finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of lived experience. "That's exactly how he ended up here," she said firmly. "His previous church handled things quietly, and all they accomplished was passing a predator along to victimize new people. We have a moral obligation to ensure he can never use pastoral authority to hurt anyone else." Over the following days, word spread through Cedar Springs like ripples in a pond. The official announcement wouldn't come until Sunday, but in a town of 3,000 people, secrets were impossible to keep. I found myself fielding phone calls from confused and angry church members who wanted to understand how such deception could have continued for so long. Some of the reactions were predictable. A small group of members, led by the Henley family's closest friends, insisted that the accusations must be false, that Pastor Henley was being persecuted by jealous individuals who couldn't accept his successful leadership. They organized prayer meetings to ask God to vindicate their pastor and expose the lies being spread about him. But most of the congregation reacted with a mixture of betrayal, anger, and profound sadness. These were people who had trusted completely, who had given sacrificially, who had brought their deepest spiritual needs to someone who had exploited rather than shepherded them. Sister Ruth summed up the general feeling during one of our many difficult conversations that week. "It's not just about the money, though that hurts enough. It's that every sermon, every prayer, every moment of supposed spiritual guidance was tainted by his deception. How do we separate the truth from the lies when everything came from the same poisoned source?" The practical implications were enormous. The church would need to undergo a complete financial audit, potentially face criminal prosecution of its former pastor, and somehow rebuild both its leadership structure and its congregation's faith. Several families announced they were leaving, unable to continue worshipping in a place that felt contaminated by betrayal. But something unexpected also began to happen. As the initial shock wore off, many congregation members started speaking about how they had noticed things that hadn't seemed right, but had dismissed their concerns out of loyalty or fear of causing trouble. People began to realize that their instincts had been correct, that the discomfort they had felt wasn't evidence of their own inadequacy, but recognition of genuine problems. The investigation revealed that Pastor Henley had disappeared, leaving town without notice and abandoning his family to deal with the consequences of his actions. Sarah Henley, it turned out, had known nothing about her husband's financial crimes or his manipulation of vulnerable women. She was left with 3 children, no income, and the devastating knowledge that her entire marriage had been built on lies. The congregation's response to Sarah and her children became a defining moment for our church's future. Despite their anger at her husband, people rallied to support the innocent family he had abandoned. They organized meal trains, helped with moving expenses when Sarah decided to return to her parents in another state, and ensured that the children understood they were not responsible for their father's sins. "This is who we really are," Helen observed, as we watched church members loading Sarah's belongings into a rental truck. Not perfect, but trying to live out genuine Christian love, even in the midst of betrayal and pain. The legal proceedings moved forward with typical bureaucratic slowness. Pastor Henley was eventually located and arrested in another state, where he had apparently begun the process of assuming a new identity and seeking employment at another church. The evidence Helen and I had gathered proved crucial to the prosecution, which resulted in convictions for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. But the real healing for our congregation would take much longer than any legal process. We had to learn how to trust again, how to distinguish between authentic spiritual leadership and manipulative charisma, how to create systems of accountability that would prevent such abuse in the future. Most importantly, we had to rediscover what faith looked like when it was grounded in truth, rather than blind trust in fallible human institutions. 5 years have passed since that devastating November when our world came crashing down around us. As I sit in my kitchen this morning, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold, I can see the church steeple through my window, the same view I've cherished for over 4 decades. But everything is different now, and somehow everything is also better. The Covenant Fellowship Church nearly didn't survive the scandal. For 3 months after Pastor Henley's arrest, our attendance dropped to barely 40 people. Many families left permanently, unable to separate their faith from the institution that had betrayed them. Others stayed away temporarily, needing time to heal before they could trust again. I understood both reactions completely, but something remarkable happened among those who remained. Without a pastor to tell us what to think or how to worship, we rediscovered what it meant to be a genuine community of faith. Helen Morrison, despite her 78 years, emerged as an unofficial spiritual leader, her decades of wisdom and unshakable integrity providing the guidance we desperately needed. "We don't need someone to interpret God for us," she said during one of our informal Sunday gatherings in the early months. "We can read the scriptures together, pray together, and figure out how to live faithfully without anyone telling us what that should look like." Those months of uncertainty were also months of unprecedented honesty. Without the pressure to maintain appearances for a charismatic leader, people began sharing their real struggles, their genuine doubts, their authentic spiritual experiences. The conversations that emerged were richer and more meaningful than any sermon I could remember. Theodore Patterson, freed from the burden of complicity and financial deception, threw himself into creating the most transparent accounting system our church had ever seen. Every expenditure, no matter how small, was documented and reported monthly to the entire congregation. He established multiple oversight committees and insisted that no single person should ever again have unchecked access to church funds. "Trust, but verify," became his motto, borrowed from an old political saying but perfectly applicable to church governance. We can love and support our leaders while still maintaining accountability. The women who had been manipulated by Pastor Henley became advocates for establishing clear boundaries in pastoral care. Carol Jenkins, the nurse who had first spoken up about inappropriate counseling, helped draft new policies requiring that all pastoral counseling sessions with women be conducted with another person present or in spaces with transparent doors. These weren't signs of suspicion, but rather wise safeguards that protected both vulnerable congregants and future pastors from compromising situations. Finding a new pastor took almost 2 years. We interviewed dozens of candidates, each one subjected to extensive background checks, reference verification, and multiple meetings with different groups within the congregation. We weren't looking for charisma or inspiring rhetoric. We were looking for character, humility, and a collaborative approach to ministry. Pastor Elizabeth Chen arrived in our community with a completely different leadership style than we had ever experienced. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and gentle eyes, she possessed theological wisdom without arrogance, spiritual insight without manipulation. Her first sermon was about the difference between faith in God and faith in religious institutions, and she acknowledged openly that sometimes those two kinds of faith could come into conflict. "I am not here to be your spiritual superstar," she told us during her first Sunday. "I'm here to serve alongside you as we all try to figure out what faithful living looks like. I will make mistakes, and when I do, I want you to tell me. Your job is not to follow me blindly, but to hold me accountable to the standards we all share." Under Pastor Chen's leadership, our congregation developed a new model of shared ministry. Decisions that had once been made unilaterally by Pastor Henley were now discussed openly in congregational meetings. Financial records were published monthly in the church bulletin. Pastoral care was provided by teams of trained lay members rather than relying solely on clerical authority. The healing process wasn't without its challenges. Some long-time members struggled with the new transparency, preferring the comfort of traditional hierarchical leadership even after experiencing its dangers. A few families left to join churches with more conventional pastoral authority, unable to adapt to our new collaborative approach. But for those who stayed and grew with us, the transformation was profound. Our congregation might be smaller now, about 120 members, compared to the 200 we had under Pastor Henley, but it's healthier, more authentic, and more genuinely loving than it ever was during our years of apparent success. I still serve as head of the ladies' ministry, but the role has evolved significantly. Instead of organizing activities around supporting a charismatic pastor, we focus on supporting each other through life's challenges. Prayer meetings have become sessions where women share honestly about their struggles with faith, doubt, parenting, aging, and loss without fear of judgment or manipulation. Helen Morrison, now 83 and still sharp as ever, often reflects on how our crisis ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed us. We had to lose our false faith, she says, before we could find our real faith. The difference is that real faith doesn't require you to stop thinking, questioning, or holding leaders accountable. Theodore Patterson has become something of a legend in our denomination for the financial transparency systems he developed in response to our crisis. Churches throughout the region have adopted his oversight models, and he regularly speaks at conferences about protecting congregations from pastoral financial abuse. He's turned his painful experience into a ministry that helps other communities avoid similar betrayal. The women who were manipulated by Pastor Henley have all found their own paths to healing. Some left organized religion entirely, which I respect, as a valid response to spiritual abuse. Others found new church homes where they felt safer. Carol Jenkins stayed with us and now leads a support group for women recovering from spiritual manipulation, offering hope and practical guidance to others who have experienced similar betrayal. As for Pastor Henley himself, he served 18 months in federal prison and was permanently barred from serving in pastoral roles within our denomination. Last I heard, he was working as a car salesman in another state, still causing harm in different ways, I imagine, but no longer able to use spiritual authority as his weapon. Sometimes people ask if I regret exposing him, if I think the pain could have been avoided by handling things more quietly. The answer is always no. The pain was already there, hidden beneath layers of deception and false loyalty. All I did was bring it into the light, where it could be addressed honestly, rather than allowed to fester in darkness. Today, as I prepare for another Thursday evening prayer meeting in my living room, I feel a peace I never experienced during the years when I thought faith meant never questioning, never doubting, never holding leaders accountable for their actions. Real faith, I've learned, is strong enough to survive truth-telling. In fact, it requires it. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you would like to share, please write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.